The notification came in at 4:17 in the afternoon, while the turkey I had cooked for no one sat cooling on my kitchen counter under a sheet of foil. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock right after I saw it, the way you look at a clock after a car accident, just to have something steady to hold on to. 4:17. A Thursday. Thanksgiving. My phone buzzed once against the table, face up, screen bright in the gray afternoon light coming through my kitchen window. I almost did not pick it up. I remember thinking, it is probably Christine, finally, telling me what time to come by, or Derek apologizing for the mix-up about pickup, because surely there had been a mix-up. Surely a woman does not spend 40 years raising 2 children, 40 years showing up, 40 years writing checks nobody asked her to explain, only to be left sitting alone in a kitchen that smelled like sage and butter and absolutely nothing else. I picked up the phone. It was Vanessa's page. My daughter-in-law posts constantly, always has. Little glimpses of a life dressed up for an audience. I do not follow her out of vanity or nosiness. I follow her because it is often the only window I have into what my grandchildren look like on any given week. That is the truth of it. That is what being a mother-in-law to a woman like Vanessa gets you. A window, not a door. The photo loaded slowly on my old phone, the way it always does, line by line, like the world revealing itself to me one careful piece at a time, so I might have a moment to brace. First, the table. Long white linen, the good china that had been a wedding gift from Walter's aunt. The china I had once eaten off of myself, at that very table, in that very dining room for 11 Thanksgivings running. Then the faces. Derek at the head, laughing with his mouth wide open, a glass of red wine tipped in his hand. Christine beside her husband Paul, her hand pressed flat and dramatic against her chest, like she had just heard the funniest thing in the world. My grandson Tyler, 11 years old, caught mid-bite of a roll, grinning at the camera like he had been coached to. And my granddaughter Lily, 16, sitting at the far end, not laughing, looking somewhere just past the lens, the only still point in a photograph built entirely out of noise. Then the caption loaded. Finally, a quiet table. No grandma, LOL. I read it twice. I am ashamed to say I read it a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I simply gave them enough chances. They did not. The letters sat there in that clean little sans serif font Vanessa always used, cheerful and rounded, the kind of font made for birthday invitations and baby shower announcements. And underneath it, 41 likes, and climbing. I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter, though it was already too late for that. My hands, I noticed, were shaking, and I found that curious, almost from a distance, the way I might have once studied a tremor in someone else's hands and thought, there, that is fear finding a body to live in. I want to tell you I cried. That would be the honest thing, and this is meant to be an honest telling. But I did not cry, not then. What I felt instead, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a 20-pound turkey going cold 6 feet away, was something colder and clearer than grief. It moved through me slowly, the way ice moves through a river in November, and by the time it reached my chest, I understood something I had spent 69 years refusing to look at directly. I was not forgotten by accident. I was forgotten on purpose. by people who had done the math and decided the sum came out better without me in it. If you have ever sat at a table set for one, on a day built for a family, you already know exactly what that silence sounds like. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from tonight, because I promise you, wherever you are, I understand. My phone buzzed again. A text this time, not a post, and the difference mattered more than I could have known in that moment. It was from Lily. "Grandma, I didn't post that I'm so sorry Mom made me sit there. Mom deleted my comment when I tried to say something. Please don't be sad. I love you." 6 words wrong in the punctuation. 16 years old and still writing the way children write when their hearts are moving faster than their thumbs. And I sat there and read it 4 times. And that finally was what broke the dam. Not the cruelty of the mother, the loyalty of the child. I put my hand over my mouth in my own empty kitchen, and I let myself cry the way I had not let myself cry since Walter's funeral. Quietly, with my shoulders shaking and no sound coming out. Because 40 years of practice teaches a woman how to grieve without disturbing anyone, even when there is no one left in the house to disturb. I did not know it yet, sitting there with cold turkey and a warm phone and a granddaughter's apology glowing in my palm. But that message from Lily was the first thread of a rope that would, in time, hold up an entire collapsing structure. I did not know that the quiet table those people were so proud of that afternoon would, within a matter of months, be quieter still, and colder, and considerably more expensive than any of them imagined. I turned my phone face down on the table. I looked at the turkey. And I thought, for the first time in longer than I could remember, not about how to make myself smaller so that I might fit more comfortably into other people's lives. I thought about what I actually owned. To understand how a 69-year-old widow ends up alone on Thanksgiving with a turkey no one will eat, you have to go back much further than that afternoon. You have to go back to a version of me that still believed devotion was something you could bank, the way you bank money, and draw against later when you needed it. My name is Margaret Ellison. Everyone who loves me calls me Maggie. And for most of my life, that was a shorter list than you would think, though I did not always understand why. I met Walter Ellison in 1979, in a hardware store his father owned on the edge of a small town in Ohio that no one outside of it has ever heard of. And I fell in love with him the way you fall in love at 22. Completely, foolishly, gratefully. Walter was not a romantic man. He was a builder, in every sense of the word. And he built our marriage the same way he built everything else, one deliberate piece at a time, checking the level twice before he ever drove a nail. He took that hardware store and turned it into a regional building supply company over 30 years, and I was beside him for every one of them, keeping the books, learning the business better than either of our children ever bothered to, standing in the warehouse in steel-toed boots when the crew was short, raising Derek and Christine in the gaps between all of it. We were not wealthy in the way people picture wealth. We did not have a yacht or a house with a name. But by the time Walter passed 12 years ago, from a heart that finally gave out the way his own father's had, we owned the company outright. We owned a modest lake house at Lake Willow that had been in his family since before I met him. And we owned a trust, drawn up carefully by a lawyer we trusted, that held nearly everything we had built together. I sold the company 2 years after Walter died. I was not going to run a building supply business alone into my 60s. And Derek, though he begged me to hand it to him, did not have the discipline his father had. I knew that. I loved him anyway, which is a different thing entirely from trusting him. And it took me years to learn to hold both truths in my hands at once without dropping either one. I sold the business for a sum that would have shocked most people who saw me clipping coupons at the grocery store on Tuesdays, because old habits, the ones that build wealth, are rarely the habits people expect wealth to keep. I tell you this not to boast. I tell you this because it is the piece of the story my own children chose not to see, even when it was sitting directly in front of them, even when it was paying their mortgage. Derek started his own contracting company 4 years ago, Ellison Restoration. And when the bank required a personal guarantor for the $180,000 line of credit he needed to get it off the ground, I signed. Of course I signed. I am his mother. Christine and Paul bought a house 2 years after that, in a neighborhood with a homeowners association and a fountain at the entrance that ran even in winter. A house slightly beyond what Paul's salary could comfortably support. And I began quietly covering the $1,150 gap between what they could pay and what the mortgage actually cost. Every month, wired directly from an account they did not know I still controlled so tightly. I paid $14,200 a year for Lily's private school, and the same again for Tyler's, because Vanessa insisted public school was, in her words, not the right environment for children with our family's standards. Our family's standards. I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count since that Thanksgiving. I have wondered exactly which of our family standards she meant. The standard of gratitude, the standard of memory, the standard of simply, occasionally, calling to ask how I was doing on a Tuesday when nothing was owed to me. I gave, and gave, and gave. Not because I was a fool, though I understand now why it looked that way from the outside, but because giving was the only language I had ever learned for love. Walter and I had built something out of nothing, board by board. And I wanted my children's lives to be easier than mine had been at the start. I wanted that so badly that I never once stopped to ask whether ease, handed over freely enough for long enough, might curdle into something closer to entitlement. It did. I know that now. There is a particular memory I return to often, from a summer 6 years ago when Lily was 10 years old and had just learned to make bread. She showed up at my back door on a Saturday morning in her pajamas, flour already dusted across one cheek, and announced that she needed a partner because her mother said kneading dough was, quote, not a skill anyone needed anymore. We spent 4 hours in my kitchen that day. I taught her the way my own mother had taught me, how to feel when the dough had been worked enough, how patience shows up in a loaf the same way it shows up in a life, quietly, and only if you give it the time. She fell asleep on my couch that afternoon with flour still on her cheek, and I sat in the chair across from her for nearly an hour, just watching her breathe, thinking that whatever else went wrong in this family, whatever else I failed to fix, I had at least gotten this one thing right. I had a granddaughter who chose me on a Saturday morning when she could have chosen anything else. I did not know, sitting in that chair 6 years ago, how much I was going to need to remember that particular Saturday. But some part of me, I think, was already storing it away. The way you store away a candle before a storm, without knowing yet that the storm is coming, only sensing in your bones that it will. Vanessa had a phrase she used often in those years, always delivered lightly, always at a family gathering, always in front of an audience large enough to make correction feel like drama. Maggie doesn't do well with big groups anymore. She said it the first time at Tyler's christening, when I mentioned wanting to help plan the reception. And she said it again at Christine's 40th birthday dinner, when I asked to be included in choosing the restaurant. And she said it a third time, more pointedly, at a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers ago, when I simply asked what time everyone was arriving. I did not do poorly with big groups. I had spent 30 years standing behind a counter talking to contractors and customers from 6 in the morning until closing. What I did poorly with, though I did not have the language for it then, was being treated like an inconvenience by people who had once needed me for absolutely everything. The third time she said it, at that barbecue, I did not let it go by. I set my glass down on the table beside the grill and I told her, plainly, in front of every person standing there, that I had run a warehouse crew of 11 men and a payroll to match, and that I was fairly confident I could manage a paper plate and a folding chair in my own son's backyard. There was a beat of silence. Then Vanessa laughed, and Derek laughed a half second after his wife did, and somebody asked who was winning the game inside, and the whole thing closed over the top of me like water over a dropped stone. I learned something that afternoon that I did not have words for until much later. A family that has decided a woman is fragile does not argue with her when she proves she is not. It simply waits, pleasantly, for her to stop talking. I want you to hold on to that phrase because it comes back. Everything in this story that mattered came back eventually, the way debts always do, whether they are debts of money or debts of decency. The Thanksgiving I have already told you about did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of a slow erosion I had felt building for at least 2 years, small tremors before the earthquake nobody warns you about. Derek stopped calling to check in, and started calling only when a payment was late reaching his account. Christine began referring to me in front of Lily and Tyler as your grandmother rather than mom, a small linguistic distance that I noticed the very first time she did it and never stopped noticing after. And there had been, in the 2 weeks before that Thanksgiving, a series of small, strange occurrences that I had not yet learned to string together into a single alarming shape. A phone call from a medical office I did not recognize, confirming an appointment I had never made for a cognitive wellness screening scheduled for the 2nd week of December. A visit from Vanessa, unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a folder of what she called insurance paperwork, asking me to sign 3 separate pages, each one folded back so that only the signature line was visible. A technique I had once watched Walter warn a new employee about, back when he still trained people himself. Never sign what you cannot read in full, he used to say, no matter who is holding the pen out to you. I had refused, telling Vanessa I would need my reading glasses and a moment alone with the pages, and she had left with a tight, unreadable smile that I filed away without understanding why it unsettled me so deeply. And there was the doorbell. I have a small camera mounted above my front door, a gift from Derek 3 Christmases ago, back when he still gave gifts that suggested he was paying attention to my life rather than managing it. 2 days before Thanksgiving, at 9:40 in the evening, the camera had caught motion in my driveway and sent an alert to my phone, the kind I usually ignored: a raccoon, a delivery, the wind moving a branch. I had not looked at that particular clip that week. I had been too busy peeling potatoes for a dinner I would end up eating alone. I did not know it yet, on that Thanksgiving evening with cold turkey and a granddaughter's apology and a strange, cold clarity settling into my chest. But that unwatched clip was sitting on my phone like a sealed envelope, waiting for the moment I would finally have a reason to open it. I did not open it that night. That night, I simply sat at my kitchen table, wrapped a plate of turkey and stuffing in foil for a neighbor down the street who I knew was also alone, and went to bed early, in a house that had never once, in 12 years without Walter, felt quite as empty as it did that particular evening. But 5 days later, my phone rang at 8 in the morning, and the name on the screen was Dorothy Voss, a woman I had known for 30 years, a retired probate court judge, my partner every Thursday night at bridge, and the sound of her voice when I answered told me, before she said a single word of substance, that whatever she was about to tell me was going to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about my own family. Dot never called before 9. That was the first thing I noticed, the wrongness of the hour itself, before I had even fully processed a word she said. "Maggie," she said, and her voice had none of its usual dry warmth in it. "Maggie, I need you to sit down, and I need you to not call anyone else until we've talked." I was already sitting, at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of me the way the turkey had cooled 5 days earlier, and I told her so, and she exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, the kind of exhale you save for news you have been dreading having to deliver. "I got a call last night from Helen Ferris," Dot said. Helen Ferris had been a court clerk in the county probate division for over 20 years, another woman from our old circle, someone who had sat 2 chairs down from Dot on the bench committee back when Dot still wore robes. "Helen doesn't do this, Maggie. She has never once called me about a filing in her life, but she called me last night because your name came across her desk, and she thought I should know before anyone else did." "What filing?" I asked her, though something in my chest had already begun to understand the shape of the answer before she gave it. "A petition," Dot said, "for conservatorship, filed in probate court yesterday morning. Your name is the subject. Derek and Christine are listed as co-petitioners." I did not say anything for a long moment. I remember the coffee cup in front of me, the small ring of condensation it had left on the wood, the ordinary Tuesday light coming through my window, all of it suddenly feeling like the set of a play I had not known I was performing in. "A conservatorship," I finally said, "is for people who cannot manage their own affairs, Dot." "I know what it's for, Maggie," she said gently. "I sat on that bench for 11 years. I know exactly what it's for, and I know exactly what it looks like when it's being used for something else." "What are they claiming?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hand, I noticed, had gone very still around the coffee cup, the way a hand goes still right before it decides whether it is capable of holding something heavy. "Cognitive decline," Dot said. "Memory issues, isolation and confusion, documented, they claim, by a family physician's assessment. There's a name attached to the filing as their attorney, Bradley Thorne." I did not know the name Bradley Thorne. I would come to know it very well. "They're asking the court to appoint Derek as your conservator of the estate," Dot continued, her voice careful now, deliberately even, the voice of a woman who has delivered devastating news across a bench for over a decade and learned exactly how to pace it. "That means full control of your finances, your accounts, any property in your name, the lake house, everything." I want to tell you that I understood immediately, in that moment, the true shape of what was happening. I did not. My first thought, God forgive me, was that there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, some well-meaning but clumsy overreach born out of genuine worry for a mother they thought was slipping. That is the particular cruelty of loving people who have wronged you. Even standing at the edge of the wound, you reach first for the explanation that lets them stay good in your eyes. I sat there in that silence for what felt like a very long time, though the clock on the stove told me it had only been 11 seconds, and I have never in my life trusted 11 seconds less than I did in that moment. "Dot," I said finally, "are you certain Helen read the name correctly?" Margaret Ellison is not an uncommon name in this county. There must be another woman somewhere with the same two syllables attached to her, a woman who actually does need someone managing her mail and her medication schedule. A woman this filing was always meant to protect. I heard Dot exhale on the other end, not impatient, never impatient with me, but weary in the particular way of a woman who has delivered this exact kind of denial back to grieving people more times across a bench than she could ever count. "She read your date of birth into the phone to me twice, Maggie," Dot said gently. "She read your address, she read the case number. There is no other Margaret Ellison in this filing. This one is yours." I looked down at my own hand, still wrapped around that cooling coffee cup, and I noticed, almost as though I were observing someone else's hand from across a room, that my knuckles had gone pale where I was gripping the ceramic. I set the cup down very carefully on its saucer, the small clink of it against the china absurdly loud in my quiet kitchen. And I found myself doing the thing I imagine every person does in the instant before they finally accept a truth they have been holding at arm's length. I began, without meaning to, running back through the calendar of the last several months, searching for the moment I must have missed, the sign I should have caught, the version of myself who had been too trusting, too slow, too willing to believe that her own children simply loved her in a language she no longer fully understood. There had been a Tuesday in October, I remembered suddenly, when Christine had called, unprompted, to ask how I was sleeping. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I had answered honestly, told her I still woke twice most nights, the way I had every night since Walter died. An old habit of a body that had spent 30 years listening for a truck backing into a warehouse loading dock before dawn. Christine had asked 3 more questions after that, gently, almost clinically. Did I ever lose track of what day it was? Did I ever forget whether I had taken my blood pressure medication? Had I, she asked, almost carelessly, almost like an afterthought, ever driven somewhere and briefly forgotten why? I had answered every question, the way you answer questions from a daughter who loves you. Honestly, without suspicion, grateful even that she was finally checking in. I had not understood, sitting on my porch that October afternoon with the phone warm against my ear, that I was being interviewed. I had thought I was simply, finally, being asked how I was. Dot, I said slowly. There was a phone call in October. Christine asked me questions about my sleep, about my memory. I answered every single one of them the way you'd answer a doctor you trusted. Do you remember what date? Dot asked. And I could hear, faintly, the sound of a pen against paper on her end of the line. The old habit of a woman who had spent a career learning that dates were never just dates. They were architecture. They were the load-bearing beams of an entire case. The middle of the month, I told her. A Tuesday. I remember it was raining because she called right as I was bringing in the mail, and I stood under the porch overhang talking to her while the rain came down on the gutters. Write that down the moment we hang up, Dot said, her voice taking on a new cadence now. Less friend, more counsel. The shift I imagined she must have made 1,000 times, sliding a robe on over her shoulders. Everything you can remember about that call. What she asked, how she asked it, what you answered, what her tone sounded like. Do the same for anything else you can think of, any visit, any phone call, any moment in the last 2 months where someone in that family asked you something that felt even slightly out of the ordinary. Why does it matter what I write down? I asked her. If the petition has already been filed, if the doctor has already given his assessment, What does my memory of a rainy Tuesday phone call change? Because Bradley Thorne is going to build his entire case out of small moments just like that one, Dot said. A pause here, a missed detail there. He is going to take fragments of your life and arrange them into a shape that looks like decline. The way a person can take true photographs and still tell an entirely false story with them, simply by choosing which ones to place beside each other. You are going to need your own record of those same moments, Maggie, told in your own words, before his version of them becomes the only version anyone else has ever heard. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something shift low in my chest. Not quite fear anymore, though fear was still there, banked beneath it like coals under ash. It was closer to the feeling I used to get standing in the warehouse at the lumber yard when a delivery truck backed in too fast toward a stack of lumber that had not been properly secured. The particular tightening of attention that comes right before you understand you are the only person in the room who has noticed the danger yet. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, Dot said, and there was a small hesitation in her voice now, the first hesitation I had heard from her since she called. Has anyone in that family asked you to sign anything recently? Anything at all? A form, a document, a piece of paper you did not read all the way through because you trusted the person holding it out to you? I felt my stomach drop, the way it drops in the half second before you realize you have missed the bottom stair. Vanessa, I said slowly, 2 weeks ago. She came by on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder. She called it insurance paperwork. She had it folded back so I could only see the signature lines. I told her I needed my reading glasses and a moment alone with the pages before I signed anything. And she left without pushing, though I remember thinking her smile looked strange when she said goodbye. Tight, like she was holding something back behind her teeth. Dot was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of its earlier gentleness. Maggie, listen to me very carefully, she said. Whatever instinct told you to ask for your reading glasses and a moment alone, I want you to trust that instinct for the rest of this. It may have already saved you more than you understand. If you had signed those pages, we would very likely be having an entirely different conversation right now. One where the fight in front of us is no longer about whether a conservatorship should exist, but about how quickly we can undo one that already does. I thought of my hand, steady enough 2 weeks ago to ask a simple, reasonable question of my own daughter-in-law. And I thought of how close that steadiness had come to being the last real choice I ever made about my own life without someone else's fingerprints on it.
I do not know how to feel about any of this yet, Dot, I admitted, and my voice, for the first time since she had called, wavered slightly. The composure I had been holding together by sheer will finally showing its first hairline crack. 20 minutes ago, I was worried about whether I had left the porch light on for the mailman. Now, I am apparently the subject of a court filing that could hand my entire life over to my son. I know, Dot said, and her voice softened again, just enough, the friend returning briefly to stand beside the judge. I am not going to pretend this is a small thing, or that you should feel calm about it right now because you shouldn't. And anyone who tells a woman in your position to simply stay calm has never actually had anything worth losing. But I need you to hear the second half of what I am about to say, because it matters more than the fear does. You are not powerless in this, Maggie. Not remotely. You are, if anything, in a stronger position than almost anyone I have ever watched walk into this exact situation. And I do not say that lightly. Why? I asked. Because in that moment, I genuinely could not see it, could not see anything past the cold fact of my own name printed beside the word incapacity in a courthouse file 2 towns over. Because they made one very specific mistake, Dot said, and for the first time in that entire phone call, I heard something in her voice that was almost, though not quite, satisfaction. They assumed that a woman who spent her whole life letting them believe she was simple was actually simple. And Maggie, I have known you for 30 years. I have watched you run numbers in your head faster than men half your age with calculators in their hands. I have watched you read a room, a ledger, and a lie with the same unhurried patience and get every single one of them right. Whatever they think they know about how easily this is going to go for them, I promise you, it is about to be the single most expensive misunderstanding of their lives. I closed my eyes for a moment, standing there in my kitchen with the coffee finally gone cold beside me, and I let myself, just for a breath, feel the full weight of everything Dot had just laid out. The petition, the doctor's report, the folder of pages folded back to hide their own contents, the rainy October phone call that had never, not for 1 second, been about how I was sleeping. And underneath all of it, quieter than the fear, quieter than the fury still gathering somewhere beneath my ribs, I felt something else stirring, something I would not have recognized in myself a year earlier, back when I still believed that love meant making myself endlessly available to people who had stopped asking what I actually needed in return. I felt the first cold thread of resolve. Dot, bless her, did not let me stay there. "Maggie," she said, and her voice sharpened just slightly, the way it must have once sharpened in a courtroom when a witness tried to slide past an inconvenient fact. "Listen to me. This filing did not happen because someone is worried about you. Filings like this take weeks to prepare. Doctors' assessments have to be arranged. Affidavits have to be gathered from people who will testify to isolation and confusion. Someone has been building a case against you for a while now, quietly. And the timing of that Thanksgiving post you told me about is not, in my professional opinion, a coincidence." The Thanksgiving post. I had told Dot about it 2 days earlier, over the phone, in the flat voice of a woman still too stunned to properly grieve. I had told her about Lily's apology text, about the cold turkey, about that phrase, "no grandma," sitting under a photograph of my family laughing without me. "They needed you isolated," Dot said quietly. "On paper, in testimony, in the eyes of a judge who has never met you, isolation looks exactly like decline. A woman with no one checking on her, a woman skipping family events, a woman easily confused, easily overlooked, easily managed. Every photograph of you not being there this year is potential evidence for them, Maggie. Whether they understood that consciously or not, I genuinely could not tell you. But someone in that family understood it, and someone hired a lawyer at least 2 months ago, which means this has been in motion since long before that dinner." I sat with that for a long moment, the cold clarity from Thanksgiving night returning, stronger now, sharper, no longer abstract. I thought of the medical office calling to confirm an appointment I never made. I thought of Vanessa standing in my kitchen with a folder of pages folded back to hide their content, asking me to sign blind. I thought of the phrase, "Maggie doesn't do well with big groups anymore," repeated at every gathering for 2 years. A phrase that, I now understood with a nausea rising slowly in my chest, had never been an excuse for my comfort at all. It had been testimony. Rehearsed testimony delivered in advance to anyone who might one day be asked whether Margaret Ellison seemed to be struggling. "I need a lawyer," I said, and my voice, when it came out, surprised me with how calm it sounded, calmer than I felt, calmer than I had any right to feel. "You need a very specific kind of lawyer," Dot said, "and I already have someone in mind. Her name is Sophia Reyes. She's young, she's sharp, and she has beaten Bradley Thorne in court twice that I personally know of. Both times,
He underestimated her because of her age. Both times, it cost his clients everything. I think, Maggie, that might be exactly the kind of mistake we want him to make again. Before I do anything else, I told her, before I call anyone, before I hire anyone, I want to see that petition. I want to read every word of it myself, in my own hand, at my own table, with my own reading glasses on, because I refuse to let anyone else tell me what has been said about my mind before I've had the chance to see it with that same mind. Dot laughed softly on the other end of the line, a short, warm, surprised sound. "There she is," she said. "That's the woman who ran a lumberyard warehouse in steel-toed boots at 59. I'll have Helen send you a certified copy today." The petition arrived by courier 2 days later, in a plain manila envelope, and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had first read those words about a quiet table with no grandma, and I opened it alone, because some griefs you have to meet without an audience, even a loving one. The language was cold in a way that pure legal language always is, but underneath the coldness, I could hear my own children's voices as clearly as if they had been sitting across from me speaking the words themselves. Subject exhibits increasing confusion regarding financial matters. Subject has become increasingly isolated from family, missing significant family gatherings, including recent Thanksgiving holiday. Subject's judgment regarding financial management has become a source of ongoing concern to immediate family. Attached, physician assessment notes, mild but concerning cognitive changes consistent with early-stage decline. I read the physician's name attached to that assessment 3 times before I placed it. Dr. Aaron Kessler, my primary care doctor for the past 11 years, a man I had trusted enough to let examine my body twice a year without a second thought. I had gone in for what I believed was a standard senior wellness visit 6 weeks earlier, a visit Vanessa had scheduled for me, driving me herself, sitting in the room the entire time, answering several of the doctor's questions before I could, a behavior I had found mildly irritating at the time and had chalked up to nothing more than an overbearing daughter-in-law who liked to be helpful in ways that were not, in fact, helpful. I had not understood, sitting in that exam room, that I was being observed for a file that did not yet exist. I had not understood that every mildly hesitant answer I gave, every moment I paused to remember which medication I took at what hour, every ordinary, human, 69-year-old moment of searching for a word was being logged, quietly, deliberately, as evidence. I sat at my table with that petition spread out in front of me, and for the first time since Walter died, I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the specific, singular fury of a woman who has just realized she has been underestimated by people who should have known better than anyone alive exactly what she was capable of. I did not cry reading that petition. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever softness Thanksgiving had cracked open in me, that petition sealed shut again, and something colder and far more useful took its place. I picked up my phone, and I opened the doorbell app I had ignored for over a week. And I scrolled back to the clip from 2 days before Thanksgiving, the one that had buzzed my phone at 9:40 at night while I peeled potatoes for a dinner no one would come to share. The footage was grainy in the porch light, but the voices came through clearly enough, and I recognized them both within the first 3 seconds. Derek and Vanessa, standing at the edge of my driveway, close together, the way people stand when they believe no one is listening. "She's not going to sign anything with a lawyer sitting next to her," Vanessa's voice said, tight with irritation. "We need Kessler's report locked in before Thanksgiving so Thorne can file right after. If she's isolated on paper and confused on paper, that's the whole case. We just need her to look like exactly what she is, an old woman who doesn't need to be at the table anymore." Derek's voice, quieter, less certain, but not, I noticed, disagreeing.
Once we've got the house at Willow and the business account cleared, none of this matters anyway. She'll be taken care of. That's what conservatorship means, Vanessa. Someone takes care of her. I sat at my kitchen table and I listened to that clip 4 times through. My own son's voice describing my future the way you might describe the disposal of an asset that had simply outlived its usefulness. And something in me that had spent 69 years bending, accommodating, forgiving, excusing, finally and permanently stopped bending. I sat with that stillness for a long moment, feeling the shape of it settle into my bones the way cold settles into a house in the first hard frost of the season. And then, because I have never once in my life been the kind of woman who can leave a wound unexamined, I made myself scroll further back through that same doorbell app, searching for anything else I might have missed in the weeks I had spent too busy, too trusting, too occupied with turkey and grocery lists to notice what was quietly assembling itself in my own driveway. I found 3 more clips before I was finished, and each one, in its own smaller way, cut just as deep as the first. The earliest was from a Tuesday in late September, nearly 2 months before Thanksgiving, time-stamped at 11:14 in the morning, a time I remembered clearly because I had been at the beauty parlor that day, getting my hair set for a church luncheon Christine had specifically told me not to bother attending, since, in her words, it was mostly younger families this year. The camera had caught Vanessa's car pulling into my driveway, and Vanessa herself stepping out with her phone already pressed to her ear, pacing a slow, tight circle near my mailbox while she talked. "I have the appointment locked in for the 23rd, her voice said, thin and slightly distorted through the small speaker, but clear enough. Kessler owes Paul a favor from the club, so he's not going to push back on the wording. I just need her isolated enough by then that it actually holds up. Christine's already stopped inviting her to the small stuff. I can handle Thanksgiving." She paused there, her voice dropping slightly, and I remember leaning closer to my own phone, as though physical proximity could somehow sharpen sound that had already been recorded and compressed and flattened by a small plastic speaker weeks earlier. "We're fine on the loan side, too," Vanessa continued, still pacing that same tight circle near my mailbox, her heels leaving small crescent indentations in the soft grass at the edge of the driveway. "Derek talked to the bank last month. As long as her name stays on the guarantee through the transition, nothing changes for the business. Once Bradley files, Derek becomes trustee, and trustee can sign anything a guarantor could sign. It's cleaner that way. Nobody at the bank even has to know anything changed." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, feeling something cold and specific settle into my stomach. Because I understood, hearing it, that this had never simply been about isolating me on paper for a hearing. It had been about continuity, about making certain that whatever machinery I had spent years quietly running on their behalf would keep running exactly the same way, under exactly the same signature, except that the hand actually holding the pen would no longer be mine. Vanessa laughed, a short, satisfied sound, and said something I did not fully catch, muffled by a passing car on the street behind her. And then her voice came back into range, clearer now, almost cheerful. "And Willow," she said. "God, can you imagine what that place is worth now? Her husband's family sat on that lake for 40 years doing absolutely nothing with it. Once this is done, we can finally list it, or keep it, whatever Derek wants. But either way, it stops just sitting there depreciating while she pretends she's still going to spend summers up there at her age." I remember hearing that particular line, feeling something rise in my throat that was not quite grief and was not quite fury, but sat instead in the strange, disorienting space between the two. The space I imagine a person occupies in the instant they realize an object they believed was simply theirs, unquestioned, permanent,
has already been mentally sold by someone else, priced, listed, and spent, long before anyone had bothered to ask whether it was for sale at all. I thought, sitting there at my kitchen table months later, listening to that recording for the first time, of Walter standing on that same dock decades earlier, teaching a much younger version of me how to bait a hook. The lake flat and silver in the early light, both of us laughing at how badly I managed it the first several tries. I thought of him telling me, not long before he died, that he wanted that place to stay in the family for as long as the family still wanted it, and that if the day ever came when none of them did, I should sell it and use the money for something that actually mattered to me, rather than let it sit there as an obligation dressed up as sentiment. He had never imagined, saying that the family in question might decide, on their own, without ever consulting me, that the day had already come, and that the money it represented already belonged, in their minds, to someone other than the woman whose name was still, at that very moment, the only name on the deed. Vanessa's call continued for perhaps another 90 seconds, most of it logistics, dates, small procedural details about paperwork and timing that I would come to understand far better in the months that followed. Sitting across from Sophia at her conference table, matching this exact conversation against the formal filing dates on the petition itself. But there was one final exchange, right before she ended the call, that I have never quite been able to set down.
I know, Vanessa said, her voice softening slightly, taking on the particular gentle, persuasive cadence I recognized from 100 family dinners, the voice she used whenever she wanted something and had decided charm would get her there faster than honesty. But look, in 6 months, none of this is going to matter. She'll be comfortable, she'll be taken care of, and honestly, at her age, isn't that kinder than pretending she can keep managing all of this herself forever? We're not doing anything wrong here. We're just being realistic before something actually goes wrong. I sat with that word for a long time after the clip ended. Realistic. As though 69 years of managing a business, a household, 2 children, a marriage, a decade of quietly funding her own household without a single missed payment added up, in the end, to nothing more than a woman one wellness visit away from needing to be managed herself. As though realism and cruelty had become, somewhere in that family's private language, entirely interchangeable words. I set my phone down on the table, and I sat there in my kitchen for a long while, listening to the particular silence of a house built for a family that no longer visited it. And I found myself returning, almost involuntarily, to that offhand comment about the beauty parlor, about the church luncheon I had not been invited to because it was, in Christine's words, mostly younger families this year. I had believed that excuse when she gave it to me. I had told myself, standing in my own kitchen with the phone still warm against my ear that particular Tuesday, that there was nothing unusual in a daughter simply forgetting, occasionally, to include her mother in every small social gathering. That families grow busier as they grow larger. That exclusion is sometimes simply the ordinary erosion of a full life, rather than the deliberate architecture of a plan. I understood now, replaying that entire conversation in my mind, that every one of those small, forgettable excuses over the preceding 2 months had been load-bearing walls in a structure I had not known was being built around me, one casual dismissal at a time, until the structure was complete enough to hold the weight of an entire legal filing. I can handle Thanksgiving. I can handle Thanksgiving. 4 words, tossed off as casually as a grocery list, and they told me more about the architecture of my own exile than the entire manila envelope sitting on my table had managed to tell me in 11 pages of legal language. Vanessa had not simply excluded me from that holiday out of cruelty, though the cruelty had certainly been real, and certainly been enjoyed. She had excluded me because exclusion was a tool, sharpened in advance, and I had been the material she intended to cut. The second clip was shorter, from the middle of October, the same week, I now understood, as Christine's rainy Tuesday phone call about my sleep and my memory, and whether I ever forgot why I had driven somewhere. This clip showed no one standing in the driveway at all. It showed only Christine's car idling at the curb for nearly 4 minutes, engine running, headlights cutting through an early evening drizzle, before finally pulling away without her ever coming to the door. I sat with that particular image longer than the others, because I understood, watching it, that I was looking at the precise moment my own daughter had sat outside my house, working up whatever nerve or whatever guilt it required to make that call. Deciding in the end that a telephone would let her ask her cruelest questions without ever having to watch my face while I answered them. There is a particular kind of loneliness in realizing that the people who loved you best, once upon a time, have started planning around you rather than with you. The way a contractor plans around a load-bearing wall he has already decided to tear out, careful only about the structural consequences, indifferent entirely to the wall itself. The third clip, the last one I found that morning, was from the Monday before Thanksgiving, and it was the one that finally, fully, broke whatever thin membrane of doubt I had still been carrying. The last small, stubborn part of me that had wanted, even then, to believe there was an innocent explanation waiting somewhere underneath all of it. It showed Bradley Thorne. I did not recognize him by sight, not yet, not until Sophia showed me his photograph weeks later, attached to the County Bar Association's directory. But I recognized the voice immediately once I heard it a second time in that courtroom months on. And in that early clip, standing at the edge of my own driveway in a coat that cost more than most of my furniture, he was speaking to Derek in the clipped, efficient cadence of a man checking items off a list, rather than discussing a human life. "We file the Monday after Thanksgiving," his voice said. "That gives us the holiday gap, the isolation pattern, and Kessler's notes all sitting inside the same 30-day window, which is exactly the kind of clean timeline a judge wants to see. Just make sure nobody in that family so much as texts her a happy Thanksgiving. I want that gap on the record looking as empty as it can possibly look." Derek's voice, close beside him, low and clipped in return. Understood. I turned the phone face down on my kitchen table, and I sat there for a long moment with my hands pressed flat against the wood, feeling something rise in my chest that I did not immediately have a name for. Something larger and colder than the fury I had already been carrying. Because fury, I was discovering, has layers, the way grief has layers, and I had only just found the floor beneath the floor I thought I had already reached. They had not simply decided, in a weak or thoughtless moment, that I was inconvenient. They had built a calendar around my erasure. They had counted the days of my own holiday the way a demolition crew counts the seconds before they finally bring a building down. Patient, methodical, entirely unbothered by the fact that a woman had lived inside those walls for 69 years. I thought, sitting there, of every Thanksgiving before that one. I thought of Derek at 7 years old, sitting on the kitchen counter beside me while I rolled out pie dough, insisting, solemnly, that he would grow up and buy me the biggest house in the whole county, so I would never again have to stand on my feet all day at that lumber yard. I thought of Christine at 9, writing me a birthday card in crayon that read, in her careful, uneven print, "You are my favorite person in the whole world, Mommy." And I thought of how completely, how utterly, a person can grow into someone who no longer resembles the child who once meant every single one of those words with her whole, small heart. I do not know how long I sat at that table before I finally moved again. Long enough that the light outside my window had shifted, the pale gray morning giving way to the flatter, harder light of early afternoon. Long enough that my coffee, made fresh that second time, had gone cold exactly the way the first cup had, as though cold coffee had become, that autumn, the quiet, recurring punctuation mark of my entire life. But when I did move, I moved with a clarity I had not felt in years. Maybe not since the week after Walter's funeral, when I had been forced, for the first time in 3 decades, to make every decision about my own life without another set of hands beside mine to share the weight of it. I understood, sitting there, that whatever came next would require exactly that same clarity, sharpened now, deliberately, into something I could actually use. I thought about my mother, briefly, who had died when I was 34, a quiet, unassuming woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated by my father, and who had told me once, not long before the stroke that took her, that the truest measure of a person's strength was never how loudly they could speak. It was how long they could wait, and how completely they could prepare before they ever had to speak at all. I had waited my entire life. I understood, sitting at that kitchen table with 3 doorbell clips and a legal petition spread out in front of me like the pieces of a puzzle I had not wanted to solve, that the waiting, at long last, was finished. I thought, too, and I want to be honest with you about this, about Lily, sitting at that Thanksgiving table with her mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line, while everyone else around her laughed too loudly at a joke made at my expense. I thought about her text message, the one still sitting in my phone, 6 words wrong in the punctuation and entirely right in everything that mattered. I thought about the fact that whatever I did next, whatever shape my response finally took, it could not simply be about punishing the people who had done this. It had to also be about protecting the one person in that family who had never, not once, stopped choosing me. That distinction, I would come to understand over the following weeks, was the single most important thing separating what I was about to build from simple, bitter revenge. Revenge asks only what will hurt them most. I was asking something else entirely. I was asking what it would take to make certain that Lily, and whatever future version of this family might still be salvageable, inherited something worth having once the wreckage finally settled. I picked up my phone one final time that morning, not to call anyone yet, but to do the one thing I still had left to do before I was ready to carry this forward into a lawyer's office and, eventually, into a courtroom. I opened the notes application Derek had shown me how to use 2 Christmases earlier, back when he still gave gifts that suggested attention rather than obligation, and I began, slowly, deliberately, typing out every detail I could remember. The rainy Tuesday phone call, the folder folded back to hide its own contents, the medical appointment I never scheduled, the 4 words that had told me everything. I can handle Thanksgiving. I was, without fully realizing it yet, building my own case before I had even hired the woman who would eventually stand up in a courtroom and argue it for me. And underneath all of it, underneath the fury and the grief and the cold, careful clarity finally settling into place, there was one single, quiet thought that kept returning to me, over and over, the way a phrase returns to you in the hours after you first hear it, refusing to let you rest until you have fully understood its weight. Someone takes care of her, Derek had said, as though care were a euphemism he had practiced in a mirror until it stopped sounding like theft. Someone takes care of her. I turned those 5 words over in my hands all morning, the way you turn over a coin you suspect is counterfeit, looking for the edge that gives it away. And every single time they came back around to me, they meant the same thing they had meant standing in that driveway at 9:40 at night. Not care. Custody. A word chosen precisely because it would sound gentle to anyone who was not the one being carried. I sat very still for a long time after that last clip ended. And then I did something I had not done in 12 years. I opened the drawer beneath my kitchen counter, the one where I still kept Walter's old business ledger, thick and leather-bound, the one he had used to teach me decades ago,
that every number tells you a true story if you are patient enough and honest enough to read it correctly. I placed my hand flat on the cover of that ledger, and I thought about a phrase my husband used to say to new hires at the lumber yard, the same phrase he had used the day he trained the young man who once tried to shortchange an elderly customer at the register, believing no one older than 70 could keep numbers straight in her own head anymore. Never assume the person across the counter from you is worth less than the numbers say they're worth, Walter used to tell them. You will lose more than you know finding out the hard way. My son and his wife were about to find that out the hard way, and I intended, from that morning forward, to make absolutely certain they found it out on my terms, in my time, and in front of every single witness who had ever mattered to me. Sophia Reyes had an office above a bakery in the older part of downtown, and when I walked in for our first meeting, still holding the manila envelope with the petition inside it, she stood up from behind her desk and shook my hand with a grip that told me everything Dot had promised was true. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp dark eyes and a legal pad already covered in notes before I had said a single word. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I read the petition Judge Voss sent over last night. I have some questions, and I want you to answer them honestly, because I am about to spend the next several months proving to a courtroom that you are one of the sharpest people they will ever have the privilege of underestimating. And I cannot do that if there is a single piece of information you are keeping from me out of politeness or loyalty." I appreciated that immediately. I had spent so much of my life being managed gently by people who assumed I needed protecting from hard truths. Sophia Reyes had decided, within the first 30 seconds of meeting me, that I could handle the whole truth. And I found myself sitting up straighter in the chair across from her, the way you sit up straighter for someone who has just shown you respect you had almost forgotten you were allowed to expect. I told her everything. The business loan I had guaranteed for Derek, the mortgage differential I had covered for Christine, the tuition for Lily and Tyler, the doctor's appointment I never scheduled, the folder of documents Vanessa had asked me to sign blind, the doorbell footage, all of it, laid out on her desk in the same order I had laid it out for myself over the preceding week. Sophia listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something down, her expression giving away nothing until I finished. And then she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This is not a hard case to win," she said finally. "But it is a hard case to win quietly. And I suspect, given everything you've told me, quiet is not actually what you want anymore." "No," I said. And I heard my own voice steady in a way it had not been steady in weeks. "It is not." "Then let's talk about what you actually own," she said, sliding a blank legal pad across the desk toward me. "Not what's in your checking account. Everything. Because I think you and I are going to need to build something that looks less like a defense and considerably more like an inheritance they were never entitled to in the first place. Coming due." I picked up her pen, and for the first time since that Thanksgiving afternoon, I felt something that was not grief and was not fury, but sat somewhere quietly between them, patient, deliberate, entirely mine. I felt ready. The weeks that followed unfolded the way I imagine a slow tide comes in, invisible if you are not watching closely, and utterly transformative if you are patient enough to wait for the water to finish rising. Sophia's first move was not dramatic. It was procedural, careful, and, she assured me, devastating in its eventual weight. We began with what she called the paper trail, an unglamorous phrase for what turned out to be the single most important weapon I owned, more powerful, in the end, than any doorbell clip or borrowed courtroom drama. I spent 3 afternoons at her office pulling together 12 years of financial records, wire transfers, mortgage payment confirmations, tuition receipts, the original loan guarantee documents from Derek's bank. Every single instance in which I had quietly, competently, and without a shred of confusion managed the flow of money that had been keeping my children's lives comfortably afloat. "You understand what this proves," Sophia said, spreading 12 years of records across her conference table like a hand of cards she already knew would win. "It proves you have been running a small, complex financial operation, entirely alone, with total accuracy for over a decade. That is not the profile of a woman experiencing cognitive decline. That is the profile of a woman these people have been financially dependent on the entire time they were building a case claiming she couldn't manage her own affairs." "The irony," I said, "is almost elegant." "It is going to be," Sophia agreed, "extremely elegant in front of a judge." We arranged, next, for 2 independent physician evaluations, both scheduled with doctors who had never met my family and had no relationship whatsoever with Dr. Kessler. I sat through cognitive assessments I found, honestly, a little insulting in their simplicity, remembering short lists of words, drawing the face of a clock, counting backward from 100 by sevens. Tasks a bright 10-year-old could complete without difficulty. I completed every one of them without a single error, and both doctors, independently, wrote reports describing my cognitive function as, in their words, entirely unremarkable for my age, and in one case, notably sharp. Dot came with me to the second evaluation, sitting in the waiting room the entire time, and when I emerged, she stood up and hugged me tightly, something she rarely did, being a woman as composed and dry-humored as I was. "I sat on a bench for 11 years, Maggie," she said quietly into my shoulder. "I watched families do this to their elders more times than I can count, and I promise you, most of those women never got the chance to fight back the way you're about to." Then she stepped back and held me at arm's length by both shoulders, and she said the thing I have carried with me every single day since. "Being needed is not the same as being loved, Maggie. It never has been. Being needed only means you are useful, and useful is the one thing a family stops thanking you for the moment they start counting on it. Every woman I ever watched get dragged into my courtroom by her own children had spent 30 years mistaking the first one for the second, and not one of them found out the difference until somebody handed her a court date." She let go of my shoulders, and the dryness came back into her voice all at once. "And I am going to enjoy this so much more than I probably should." The next piece of the plan involved Walter's original trust, the Walter and Margaret Ellison Family Trust, drawn up together 22 years earlier by a lawyer who had since retired to Florida, but whose original documents Sophia retrieved and read with the kind of careful attention that made me grateful, all over again, for the man I had married. "There is a clause in here," Sophia said one afternoon, tapping a specific paragraph with her pen, "that neither Derek nor Christine appear to know exists. It requires unanimous certification of incapacity, in writing, from 2 independent physicians of the trustee's own choosing before any successor trustee can act on the estate. Not one doctor cherry-picked by a family member with a motive. 2, chosen by you, agreeing independently." "Walter built that clause in himself," I told her, remembering the afternoon he had insisted on it, years before either of us imagined we would ever need it. Remembering him saying, almost offhandedly at the time, "You can't build a house without planning for the storm that hasn't come yet, Maggie. That's just asking to lose the roof." He had been talking about the business at the time. I understood now that he had, without ever intending to, also been talking about this. "He protected you from exactly this," Sophia said quietly, "before either of you had any reason to think it was necessary. "That is not luck, Mrs. Ellison. That is a man who understood his own family better than he ever let on." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the particular ache of missing a man who had, it turned out, been quietly guarding me from 12 years into the future, long after he was gone. Then Sophia and I began the piece of the plan that I had, privately, been dreading and anticipating in equal measure: the financial freeze. "We are going to do this carefully and in a specific order," Sophia explained, "and I want you to understand that once we begin, there is no undoing it gracefully. This is not a message you are sending them. This is a door closing." I understood, and I told her without hesitation exactly how I wanted it done. The lake house title had, from the day Walter's estate finished settling 12 years earlier, been solely in my name, a fact Derek had somehow convinced himself did not matter, believing, apparently, that family ownership was a matter of sentiment rather than legal document. Sophia drafted a formal notice, informing Derek in writing that his understanding of the property's ownership had always been informal and was, as of that date, formally clarified. The lake house belonged to me, and only me, and any future access to it would require an invitation, the way it should have required an invitation for the past several years. I signed that notice on a Thursday morning, sitting across from Sophia at her conference table, and I want to tell you honestly that my hand did not shake the way it had shaken on Thanksgiving night, holding that phone with its cruel little caption glowing up at me. My hand was steady. That steadiness surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened in the preceding weeks, because I had spent so much of my life believing that strength, when it finally arrived, would feel like fire. It did not feel like fire. It felt like the particular calm of a woman finally putting a level to a wall she had been asked, for years, to simply trust was straight. I remember looking down at the pen in my hand before I set it to that page, an ordinary ballpoint pen from a cup on Sophia's desk, blue plastic, the kind of pen you might find in any office in the country. And I remember thinking, almost absurdly, that a moment this large deserved something finer. Then I caught myself in that thought and nearly laughed out loud, right there in that quiet conference room, because I understood, in the same breath, exactly how much of my life I had spent believing that important moments required important objects: fine pens, good china, a proper dress, as though dignity were something you could purchase, rather than something you simply decided, one morning, to finally claim for yourself. Walter had used a plain pen his entire life. He used to say that a signature was only as good as the hand behind it, and that men who needed a gold pen to feel important had usually never once, in their whole lives, been asked to sign something that actually mattered. I thought of him then, sitting in that office above the bakery, the faint, warm smell of bread rising up through the floor vents from the shop below, and I thought that he would have approved, entirely, of a plain blue pen finishing what a lifetime of careful, patient building had made possible. The room itself was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet just before something irreversible happens inside them. Sophia's office was small, a converted second-floor space above the bakery, with tall windows that let in a flat, gray winter light, bookshelves crowded with case binders instead of decoration, a single potted fern on the windowsill that looked, I remember thinking, like it had survived on nothing but neglect and stubbornness for longer than either of us could account for. There was a clock on the wall behind her desk, an old-fashioned one with a visible second hand, and I remember hearing it tick through the last several seconds before I finally lowered the pen to the page, each second landing in that silence like a small, deliberate weight. I thought, in that final moment before I signed, of every version of myself that had led me to that particular chair. The young woman standing behind the counter of a hardware store in 1979, terrified and thrilled in equal measure by a man who checked a level twice before he ever trusted a wall. the mother who had once stood in a hospital hallway for 6 hours, waiting for word on whether her husband's heart would hold, and who had held herself together in that hallway by mentally reorganizing the company's accounts payable, because numbers, unlike grief, could always be made to balance if you were patient enough with them. The widow who had sat alone at a kitchen table on a Thanksgiving evening 3 weeks earlier, reading 4 words under a photograph of her own family laughing without her. Every one of those women, I understood, sitting in that office with a plain blue pen in my hand, had been quietly building toward this exact signature, whether any of us had known it or not. I lowered the pen, and I signed my name, Margaret Ellison, in the same steady, looping script I had used to sign payroll checks at the lumberyard for 30 years. The same script that had once co-signed a $180,000 loan out of nothing but love. And I felt, watching the ink settle into the paper, that I was not simply closing a door. I was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, opening one. A door I had not even realized, until that exact moment, I had spent most of my adult life standing quietly outside of. I set the pen down on the table, and I did not pick it back up. I did not need to. Whatever else that document required of me, my part in it, the hardest part, the part that asked something of my heart rather than merely my hand, was already finished. Sophia had not said a word during any of it. I want to note that, because I have thought about it often since, how rare it is to find a person willing to sit in complete silence beside you while you do something that costs you more than they will ever fully understand, without once rushing you toward the end of it. She had simply watched, her own hands folded on the table in front of her, giving me the entire weight of that quiet room to finish what I had come there to do. Sophia watched me sign it, and then she folded the letter into a plain envelope, and she looked at me across the table with an expression I had not yet seen from her, something gentler than the sharp, efficient competence she had shown me in every previous meeting. "You understand what this is going to feel like for him," she said carefully. "Not legally. Legally, this is the cleanest, most defensible piece of everything we're doing, because that title has been in your name and nobody else's for 12 years. But emotionally, Mrs. Ellison, your son grew up spending summers at that lake house. I read through the family history you gave me. I know what that place means to him, whatever else he's done. I know exactly what it means to him," I told her, and my voice, when it came out, carried more weight in it than I expected, a weight I had been carrying quietly for weeks without fully setting it down anywhere. Walter taught him to fish off that dock when he was 5 years old. I have a photograph somewhere of the two of them sitting on the end of it at sunrise, Derek's feet not even reaching the water. I have spent 3 weeks now listening to a recording of my own son describing my future in a driveway, like an asset to be liquidated, playing it back until I knew every pause in it by heart. And some part of me still wanted to protect the version of him who sat on that dock at 5 years old, feet dangling, believing the whole world was exactly as safe and as simple as it looked from where he was sitting. But that version of him, I continued, is not the version who stood in my driveway 2 nights before Thanksgiving and told his wife that once they had the house at Willow, none of the rest of it would matter, because I would be, in his words, taken care of. I cannot keep protecting a 5-year-old who no longer exists, at the expense of protecting the woman I actually am, sitting in this chair right now at 69 years old. Sophia nodded slowly, and something in her posture told me she had needed to hear me say that out loud as much as I had needed to say it. "Then let's send it," she said, and we drove together to the post office that same afternoon, and I stood at the counter and watched the clerk stamp that envelope, certified mail, return receipt requested. a small yellow slip pressed against the front of it, like a seal on something far more permanent than paper. I did not know it yet, standing at that counter, but the return receipt for that letter would arrive back in Sophia's office 9 days later, signed in Derek's own hand, the date and time stamped in blue ink at the bottom. And Sophia would tell me, months afterward, that she had kept that small green card in his file the entire time. Because a signature on a return receipt is a very particular kind of evidence. It proves not only that a message was delivered, it proves that it was received and understood, and that whatever happened afterward, no one in that family could ever again claim they had not been told, plainly and formally, exactly where they stood. "I want to ask you something," I said to Sophia later that same week, sitting in her office with a fresh legal pad between us, the loan letter still unfinished on her desk. "How do you decide the order? Why the lake house first and not the money?" "Because the lake house is not just an asset," Sophia said. "It is a symbol, and symbols move slower than money does. If we had frozen the mortgage payment first, Christine would have felt the absence of it within 30 days, in a very concrete, very panicked way. And panic makes people reckless. It makes them call lawyers of their own, file motions, escalate in directions we cannot predict. But the lake house notice does something quieter. It tells them, without any immediate financial consequence at all, that the ground beneath them has already shifted. It gives them time to feel the shift before the money follows it. And in my experience, Mrs. Ellison, people who feel the ground shifting under them slowly are far less dangerous in a courtroom than people who feel it collapse all at once. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I used to turn over a set of numbers in Walter's old ledger, checking them against each other until they balanced. "There is another reason," Sophia added, quieter now, watching me carefully. "The lake house notice costs them nothing financially. Not yet, which means when the conservatorship hearing eventually happens and Bradley Thorne inevitably tries to argue that all of this was retaliatory, an angry woman lashing out to punish her children financially, we will have a clean, documented example of you asserting a purely legal right, weeks before a single dollar changed hands. It establishes a pattern the court will understand immediately. This was never about punishment, Mrs. Ellison. This was about protection, exercised patiently, in the correct order, exactly the way a woman manages a business she actually understands." I had not thought of it in quite those terms before she said it, but she was right, and I told her so, and I remember feeling, in that moment, a small, strange gratitude toward a woman 35 years my junior who had somehow understood, faster and more completely than either of my own children ever had, exactly what kind of woman I actually was underneath all those years of quiet accommodation. Dot called me that same evening, as she often did during that stretch of preparation, ostensibly to talk about bridge, though bridge rarely lasted more than 5 minutes of any of our calls anymore. "How did today go?" she asked, and I told her, and she was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line before she spoke again. "You know," she said finally, "I sat on that bench for 11 years, Maggie, and I watched a great many people walk into my courtroom absolutely certain that anger was the only tool available to them. Anger feels satisfying in the moment. It rarely wins anything. What you're building right now, piece by piece with Sophia, that is not anger. That is architecture. And architecture, done correctly, outlasts every tantrum anyone else in that family is capable of throwing." I sat on my back porch that evening after we hung up, wrapped in the same good wool coat I had laid out across a chair for Thanksgiving dinner 3 weeks earlier, a dinner I had ended up eating alone at a table set for one. And I looked out over my own modest yard in the last gray light of a December afternoon, and I let myself think, honestly and without flinching, about what I was actually doing. I was not simply defending myself against a petition. I understood that clearly by then. I was dismantling, piece by careful piece, an entire structure of dependency I had spent over a decade building without ever once asking myself whether it was healthy, for them or for me. I had told myself, for years, that paying for Derek's business loan and Christine's mortgage gap and 2 children's private school tuition was love, uncomplicated and generous, exactly the way Walter and I had always understood love, as something you built with your hands and handed over freely. I understood now, sitting on that porch in the cold, that generosity without any boundary at all does not always feel like love to the person receiving it. Sometimes, if you are not careful, if you never once ask anything in return, it starts to feel like an entitlement, a permanent fixture of the landscape, as unremarkable and as unappreciated as the electricity that simply appears every time you flip a switch. And when the person supplying that electricity finally, quietly, threatens to turn it off, the people who have grown dependent on it do not always respond with gratitude for everything they were given. Sometimes, I thought, sitting there with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone lukewarm in the cold evening air, they respond instead with the particular ugly fury of people who have just discovered that the ground they built their entire lives on top of was never actually theirs to build on in the first place. I thought, too, about something Walter used to say, back when Derek was young and just beginning to show the first small signs of the entitlement that would, decades later, grow into a driveway conversation about conservatorship and lake houses. Walter had never been a harsh father, but he had been a clear one, and I remembered him sitting Derek down at 17, after the boy had wrecked a truck Walter had loaned him for the summer, without so much as an apology, and telling him, calmly, in the same voice he used with new hires at the lumber yard, that the people who love you the most are not always the people who owe you the most, and confusing those two things, Derek, will be the single most expensive mistake you ever make in your life. I do not think either of us, sitting in that kitchen nearly 30 years ago, fully understood how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be. The following Tuesday, Sophia and I sat down to finalize the loan letter, and this time, when she slid the draft across the table toward me, I read it twice before I signed it, not out of hesitation, but out of a genuine desire to understand every single word of a decision that would, within 90 days, very likely end my son's company. I am not going to pretend to you that signing that particular letter felt the same as signing the lake house notice, I told Sophia, setting down the pen. The lake house is a place. This is $180,000 and a business and a crew of men who have families of their own, who did nothing wrong, and who are about to lose their jobs because of a decision my son made in a driveway a month ago. Sophia was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about often in the time since. You are allowed to grieve the consequences of someone else's choices, Mrs. Ellison, even while you enforce them. That grief does not mean you are doing the wrong thing. It means you are still, underneath everything else, a decent person, doing a hard thing for the right reasons. The men on that crew will find other work. Contractors do, more often than people assume. What they will not find anywhere else is a mother willing to keep quietly absorbing the risk of her son's poor judgment for another decade. At the exact moment that son was trying to have her declared legally incompetent to manage her own money. I signed the letter. We sent it to the bank's underwriting department that same afternoon, along with a formal notice to Derek, informing him that my personal guarantee on the Ellison restoration line of credit would be withdrawn, effective in 90 days, per the maximum grace period the bank's own policy allowed. The bank's underwriting officer called Sophia 4 days later, polite, careful, and, I thought, entirely unsurprised, and confirmed the withdrawal in writing before the week was out. 90 days for Derek to find another guarantor or another lender, or, as Sophia put it more bluntly, 90 days to discover exactly how solvent Ellison Restoration actually was, without his mother's signature quietly propping up its foundation. The mortgage differential I stopped immediately. The $1,150 a month simply ceasing to appear. No warning, no explanation. The account simply going quiet, the way my invitation to that Thanksgiving table had gone quiet weeks before. And the tuition? The one piece of all of it that had genuinely nothing to do with punishing anyone. I redirected rather than cut. I contacted both schools directly, established new tuition accounts in my own name, payable by me, directly to the institutions, entirely bypassing Derek, Vanessa, Christine, and Paul. Lily and Tyler's education would continue uninterrupted. Their parents simply would no longer have any control over it, any credit for it, or any ability to threaten it. Some people you protect by giving them everything, Sophia said, when I explained that particular decision to her. And some people you protect by making sure the people who hurt them can never again use love as leverage. It sounds like you already understand the difference better than most of my clients ever do. I had learned that difference, I told her, at a kitchen table over a plate of cold turkey, from a granddaughter brave enough to text her grandmother an apology while sitting in the very room where her own mother had orchestrated the cruelty. It was around this time, in the deep, quiet middle of that preparation, in the last few days before Christmas, that Lily appeared at my back door unannounced, exactly the way she had 6 years earlier, flour-dusted pajamas replaced now by a college sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, her expression carrying none of the softness of that earlier memory. "Grandma," she said, standing on my porch in the cold, "I found something in Dad's office. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was looking for the stapler. There's a folder with your name on it, and a lawyer's card, and I don't understand everything in it, but I understand enough to know something is very wrong, and I need you to tell me the truth." I let her in. I made her tea, the way I had made her tea 100 times before, and I told her, gently but completely, exactly what her parents had done, and exactly what I intended to do about it. She sat across from me at that same kitchen table, her hands wrapped tight around the mug, and when I finished, her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set in a way that reminded me, sharply and suddenly, of her grandfather. 16 years old, and already learning the particular grief of realizing your parents are capable of something you did not think parents were capable of. "They wanted to take everything from you," she said quietly, "and they used me sitting at that stupid table to do it." "No," I told her, reaching across to take her hand. "They tried to. There is a very important difference, Lily, between what people try to take from you and what they actually manage to get away with. I need you to understand that difference, because I think you are about to watch me teach your parents the same lesson." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, and then, in a voice that had gone suddenly steady, she asked me the question that told me, more than anything else in that entire terrible season, that I had at least one person left in that family worth fighting to keep. "What do you need me to do, Grandma?" "I need you to keep doing exactly what you have always done," I told her. "Tell me the truth. That is worth more to me right now than any lawyer, any judge, or any folder in your father's office." She stayed for dinner that night, the first real dinner I had shared with anyone since Thanksgiving. And though the circumstances were dark, there was, underneath them, a small, stubborn warmth, the sense of a foundation, cracked in places, still holding in the spots that mattered most. The hearing date arrived on a cold morning in late January, gray sky, thin frost on the courthouse steps, and I stood at the base of them in a simple charcoal coat, Sophia beside me with a leather folder tucked under one arm, and I felt, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something close to peace. "Whatever happens today," Sophia said quietly as we climbed the steps together, "you already won the part that mattered most. You stopped being afraid of them. Everything that happens in that courtroom is just paperwork catching up to a decision you already made weeks ago." I want to describe that courtroom to you carefully, because I have thought about it often since, the particular geography of a room where power is meant to be decided. Wood-paneled walls the color of strong tea. A judge's bench raised just high enough to remind everyone below it who, in that specific hour, held the authority. Rows of hard benches on either side of a center aisle, the kind of aisle that, in another context, might have carried a bride toward a wedding, but that morning carried instead a family toward a reckoning none of them, save for me, had fully anticipated. Derek and Christine sat together on the petitioner's side, both dressed with a formality that struck me as almost theatrical. Derek in a suit I did not recognize, Christine in a blazer with her hair pulled back severely, the posture of people who believed, right up until the moment they no longer could, that they were the reasonable ones in this room. Vanessa sat directly behind them, close enough to lean forward and whisper, which she did, twice in the first 10 minutes, each time drawing a sharp look from the bailiff. Paul sat beside Christine, quiet, uncomfortable, a man who I suspected had never fully believed in this plan and lacked the spine to say so out loud. And beside him, unexpectedly, sat Lily, in a plain gray wool dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap, having insisted, against her mother's objections, on attending. She caught my eye once, briefly, as I walked past toward my own seat, and gave me the smallest, steadiest nod I had ever received from anyone in my life. Bradley Thorne stood when the judge entered, a tall man in his 50s with the smooth, practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades believing that confidence alone could substitute for preparation. Judge Marsh, presiding, was a woman perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the particular unimpressed stillness of someone who had heard every kind of argument this courtroom could produce and had long ago stopped being moved by theater. "We are here," Judge Marsh said, opening a folder in front of her, "to review a petition for conservatorship of the person and estate of Margaret Ellison, filed by her son, Derek Ellison, and daughter, Christine Ellison Pratt. Mr. Thorne, you may proceed." Thorne rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket, and began exactly the way Sophia had predicted he would, leading with sympathy, painting a portrait of a loving, worried family reluctantly forced into difficult legal action out of nothing but concern for a beloved matriarch showing troubling signs of decline. "Your Honor," he began, "this is, at its heart, a story about love. About children who noticed their mother slipping, quietly, gradually, in the way that these things so often happen, and who made the difficult, painful decision to seek help rather than watch her struggle alone." He called Dr. Kessler first, who testified, with the careful, hedging language doctors use when they know they are standing on thinner ice than they would like, about mild cognitive changes observed during a wellness visit, about hesitation in answering certain questions, about a pattern he described as, quote, "consistent with early concerns worth monitoring." Sophia's cross-examination lasted less than 8 minutes, and I watched, with a satisfaction I am not proud of but will not pretend I did not feel, as she dismantled that testimony piece by careful piece. "Dr. Kessler," she began, "who scheduled the appointment in question?" "I believe," he said, checking his notes, "a family member, a Vanessa Ellison." "And who was present in the exam room during the entire visit?" "Mrs. Ellison, and her daughter-in-law, yes." "And did the daughter-in-law, Vanessa Ellison, answer any questions on Mrs. Ellison's behalf during that visit?" A pause. "Some, yes." "It's not unusual for family members to assist. And when precisely did Vanessa Ellison contact your office to schedule that particular appointment?" Sophia asked, her tone still perfectly even, the tone of a woman laying bricks one at a time rather than throwing stones. Dr. Kessler flipped back through several pages of his own file before answering, and I watched his hand hesitate slightly over the paper. The small, involuntary tell of a man who has begun to sense, without yet fully understanding why, that the ground beneath his testimony has grown considerably less stable than it felt 20 minutes earlier. 6 weeks prior to the visit, he said finally, she called and specifically requested a senior wellness screening and asked that it be scheduled during a week when, in her words, family would be available to help coordinate. Sophia let that sit in the room for a moment before continuing, and I noticed, watching her, that she had a particular gift for silence. The same gift Dot had once told me was the true mark of a skilled litigator, the discipline to let a damaging answer breathe in a courtroom, rather than rushing past it toward the next question. "Dr. Kessler," she said, "did Vanessa Ellison, at any point during that 6-week window, communicate to you or your office any specific concern that Mrs. Ellison's family intended to use the results of that visit in a legal proceeding?" "No," he said. And then, almost immediately, as though some instinct for self-preservation had finally caught up to the danger in the question, he added, "Not that I recall." "Not that you recall," Sophia repeated. And something in the careful, unhurried way she said it made the phrase sound considerably worse than it had sounded coming out of his own mouth. "I want to be precise here, Doctor, because precision matters a great deal in a proceeding like this one. Is it your testimony, under oath, that Vanessa Ellison never mentioned, at any point, prior to or during that appointment, anything about a petition, a conservatorship, or an attorney named Bradley Thorne?" I could see Thorne shift in his seat at the mention of his own name. A small, sharp movement, the posture of a man recalculating, in real time, exactly how much damage was accumulating on the other side of the room. "I don't recall a conversation like that specifically, no," Dr. Kessler said. And this time, his voice had lost the smooth, professional cadence it carried at the start of his testimony, replaced now with something closer to the careful hedging of a man beginning to realize that every answer he gave was being weighed and measured and found wanting. I sat very still in my seat throughout that exchange, my hands folded in my lap the way my own mother had once taught me to sit in church as a girl. And I found myself thinking, watching a man I had trusted with my own body for 11 years slowly come apart under careful, measured questioning, that there is a particular kind of grief in watching someone reveal, piece by piece, exactly how easily they were willing to compromise their own integrity for the convenience of people who never once deserved that kind of loyalty. I glanced once toward the gallery behind me and caught Lily watching the exchange with an expression I had not seen on her young face before, something between fascination and a dawning, uncomfortable clarity. The look of a 16-year-old watching adults reveal exactly how far they were capable of bending the truth when they believed no one competent enough to notice was paying close attention.
Dr. Kessler, Sophia continued, moving now toward the center of the room. I want to walk through your written notes with you, the ones attached as Exhibit C to the petition currently before this court. On page 2, you wrote, quote, "Patient exhibited a brief pause of approximately 4 to 5 seconds when asked to name the current president, followed by a correct answer." Is that an accurate reading of your own note? Yes, he said. And in your professional opinion, doctor, is a 4 to 5 second pause before correctly answering a general knowledge question on its own indicative of cognitive decline? On its own, he said slowly. No. Context matters. Anxiety in a clinical setting can produce similar pauses. Fatigue can produce similar pauses. So can simply being, he paused himself, almost as though hearing the irony of his own hesitation. Being asked a question by a doctor you don't see very often. In a room with your daughter-in-law sitting 3 feet away watching you answer it. A small, unexpected ripple moved through the gallery at that, not quite laughter, but something close to it. The sound of people recognizing, together, the exact moment a witness had accidentally told the truth despite himself. Judge Marsh did not smile, but I noticed her pen pause over her notepad for a fraction of a second longer than it had paused during any previous answer. And I understood, watching that small, almost imperceptible gesture, that whatever she was writing down in that moment mattered a great deal more than anything Bradley Thorne had said in his opening remarks 20 minutes earlier. "Thank you, Doctor," Sophia said. "I have one final question before I turn to the specific standard I mentioned earlier. In your 11 years treating Mrs. Ellison, prior to this particular visit, had you ever, at any point, documented any concern whatsoever regarding her memory, her judgment, or her cognitive function?" There was a long pause before he answered. Long enough that I found myself holding my own breath without fully realizing I had started. "No," he said finally. "Her chart, prior to this visit, shows no such concerns." "Not one. In 11 years," Sophia said. And it was not phrased as a question, though it landed with all the weight of one anyway, settling over that courtroom the way a light snow settles over a quiet street, soft and slow, and impossible to ignore once it has finally covered everything in sight. "Not one," Dr. Kessler agreed quietly. And for the first time since he had taken the stand, he looked, briefly, toward Vanessa, sitting rigid in the gallery with her jaw set and her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet his gaze. And I thought, watching that small, failed exchange between them, that whatever debt of loyalty Vanessa believed she had purchased from that man the previous autumn, with one phone call and one conveniently scheduled appointment, had just been revealed in front of a judge, a court reporter, and a room full of witnesses, to be worth considerably less than either of them had assumed. Sophia returned to her table, glanced briefly at the legal pad in front of her, and then looked back up at the witness stand with the particular unhurried patience of a woman who understood that the most important question of the entire exchange was still waiting, carefully, to be asked. "Dr. Kessler," Sophia continued, her voice level, unhurried. "Is it standard medical practice to base a diagnosis of cognitive decline on a single observational visit, arranged and attended by a family member who stands to financially benefit from that diagnosis, without any follow-up testing, neuroimaging, or referral to a specialist?" Thorne objected. The judge allowed it. Dr. Kessler, visibly uncomfortable now, admitted, under continued careful pressure, that no,
That would not typically be considered a sufficient basis for a formal cognitive decline diagnosis, and that his notes, in hindsight, had been, in his word, preliminary rather than conclusive. Sophia thanked him and sat down, and I watched Bradley Thorne's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the first small crack in an expression that had, until that moment, remained entirely smooth. Then it was our turn. Sophia called both independent physicians first, whose reports, read aloud into the record, described my cognitive function in terms that stood in stark, almost embarrassing contrast to the vague concerns Dr. Kessler had offered. Unremarkable for her age, notably sharp, no indication whatsoever of any decline consistent with the claims presented in the petition.
Then she called Judge Voss, retired, as a character witness, and Dot testified with the calm, unshakable authority of a woman who had spent 11 years on that very bench, describing 30 years of friendship, weekly bridge games that required exactly the kind of sharp, strategic memory a declining mind could not sustain, and a woman she considered, in her own words, one of the most financially competent people she had ever personally known. Then Sophia introduced the financial records, 12 years of them, laid out methodically across an easel beside the witness stand. Wire transfers, mortgage payment confirmations, tuition receipts, the original loan guarantee documents. Every dollar I had quietly moved to support the very people now claiming I could not be trusted to manage a checkbook. "Your Honor," Sophia said, turning to face the bench directly, "I would like the record to reflect that the woman these petitioners claim is incapable of managing her own finances has, for the past 12 years, been solely and successfully managing not only her own finances, but substantial portions of theirs. She personally guaranteed a $180,000 business loan for her son. She has covered an average of $1,150 a month toward her daughter's mortgage. She has paid, in full, private school tuition for 2 grandchildren, totaling over $28,000 annually. Every one of these arrangements was managed by Mrs. Ellison herself, personally, without error, for over a decade. I would ask the court to consider what it means that the same family now claiming she cannot manage her own affairs has, for years, been entirely dependent on her doing exactly that, extremely well, on their behalf." I watched Christine's face during that recitation, watched the color drain from it in slow, visible stages, the way I imagine color drains from a photograph left too long in direct sunlight. Derek stared straight ahead, his jaw working, saying nothing. Then Sophia played the doorbell footage. The courtroom went very still as Vanessa's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable, coming through the small speaker Sophia had connected to her laptop. "She's not going to sign anything with a lawyer sitting next to her. We need Kessler's report locked in before Thanksgiving so Thorne can file right after. If she's isolated on paper and confused on paper, that's the whole case. We just need her to look like exactly what she is, an old woman who doesn't need to be at the table anymore." I did not look at Vanessa while that clip played. I did not need to. I could hear, in the sharp intake of breath from someone behind me, and in the low murmur that moved through the gallery, exactly what her face must have looked like. Derek's voice followed, quieter but equally damning. "Once we've got the house at Willow and the business account cleared, none of this matters anyway. She'll be taken care of. That's what conservatorship means, Vanessa. Someone takes care of her." The silence that followed that recording was the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. Judge Marsh removed her glasses slowly and set them on the bench in front of her, and looked, for a long, deliberate moment, first at Derek and then at Christine, and then, longest of all, at Vanessa, who had gone the color of the wall behind her. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said finally, her voice carrying none of the neutral patience it had held 20 minutes earlier, "would you like to address the recording just played for this court, or would you prefer I draw my own conclusions?" Thorne, to his credit, or perhaps simply to the credit of his own self-preservation, said nothing further of substance. I watched him, in that moment, begin quietly calculating the difference between representing a losing case and being personally associated with one that had just, on the record, revealed itself to be fraudulent. Sophia rose one final time and asked to introduce one last piece of evidence, a copy of the trust document Walter and I had drawn up 22 years earlier, and specifically, the clause requiring unanimous certification of incapacity by 2 independent physicians before any successor trustee could act. "Your Honor," Sophia said, "this court has now heard from 2 such independent physicians, neither selected by, arranged by, or in any relationship with the petitioners, and both have found Mrs. Ellison to be of entirely sound and unremarkable cognitive function for her age. The petition before you does not simply fail to meet its burden of proof. It fails to meet a threshold that Mrs. Ellison and her late husband specifically built into their own estate planning over 2 decades ago. Precisely, I would suggest, Your Honor, to guard against exactly this kind of attempt." Judge Marsh was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the folder in front of her. And then she looked up, directly at me for the first time in the entire proceeding. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "is there anything you would like to say before I rule?" I stood. I had not planned, walking into that courtroom that morning, to speak at all. Sophia had told me it was my choice and only mine, and standing there, in my simple charcoal coat, looking at the faces of my son and my daughter, and the woman who had orchestrated so much of this, I found that I did, after all, have something I needed to say. "Thank you, Your Honor," I began, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. "I have spent a great deal of the last 2 months trying to understand how I arrived in this courtroom, and I think I finally understand it. I spent 40 years believing that love was something you proved through what you were willing to give away. I gave a business loan. I gave a mortgage payment. I gave 2 educations. I gave without ever once being asked to account for what I was giving or thanked for it in any lasting way. And somewhere along the line, the people I gave those things to stopped seeing a mother and started seeing an account that, eventually, they decided they would simply prefer to control outright, rather than continue asking politely for withdrawals from. A friend of mine, Your Honor, a woman who sat on a bench in a room very much like this one for 11 years, told me something this winter that I have not been able to set down since. Being needed is not the same as being loved. I spent 40 years mistaking the first one for the second, and I would like the record of this court to show that I am finished doing that." I paused and looked briefly at Derek, whose eyes I do not think left the table in front of him for the rest of my statement. "Last Thanksgiving," I continued, "my son and daughter and their families posted a photograph online of a holiday table, celebrating, in writing, that it was finally quiet because there was, and I am quoting this exactly, no grandma. I have thought about that phrase every single day since, and I have decided that if a quiet table without me in it was truly what this family wanted, then I intend to give them exactly that, permanently, on my own terms rather than theirs. I am not asking this court for revenge, Your Honor. I am asking this court to recognize what the evidence has already shown, that I am entirely capable of managing my own affairs,
that I have been managing considerably more than my own affairs for over a decade, and that the people who filed this petition did not do so out of concern for my well-being. They did so because they had already decided, quietly, in a driveway, on a night they believed no one was listening, that an old woman who no longer needed to be at the table also, conveniently, no longer needed to be asked before her life was taken from her. I sat down. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, and then Judge Marsh closed the folder in front of her with a soft, decisive sound that seemed to echo far longer than the noise itself should have carried. "This petition is denied," she said, "in full and with prejudice. I am additionally referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential elder financial abuse violations, given the evidence presented today, and I would strongly advise petitioner's counsel to consider his own potential exposure in having filed this action on the basis of, at minimum, a grossly inadequate medical assessment." I felt the breath leave my body all at once. 12 years of quiet holding released in a single long exhale. And beside me, I heard Dot, sitting in the row behind, murmur something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "about time." Vanessa was crying by the time we reached the hallway outside the courtroom. Loud, performative sobs that echoed off the marble floor. And Derek stood beside her, looking pale and stunned. And Christine had already turned to Bradley Thorne, her voice climbing sharply, demanding to know how this had happened, how any of this had happened, as though the answer were not sitting directly in front of her in the shape of her own choices. I did not linger to watch the collapse. I want to be honest about that, because a lesser telling of this story might have me standing triumphantly in that hallway, savoring every tear. I did not savor it. I felt instead a strange, hollow ache. The particular grief of watching people you love destroy the last of your trust in them with their own hands, in real time, in a public hallway, with nothing left to hide behind. But Lily found me before I reached the elevator, her eyes red, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for mine. "Grandma," she said, "is it over?" "The petition is over," I told her gently. "What happens with your parents now? That part is only just beginning, and it will look very different than what happened today. But you, sweetheart, you are safe. Your school is paid for, your future is protected, and none of what happens to them from here forward is going to touch you. Not if I have anything to say about it." She hugged me tightly in that hallway, and over her shoulder, I watched Derek finally look up, finally meet my eyes across the distance between us. And whatever he saw in my face in that moment, I do not know, because I turned, with my granddaughter's arms still linked through mine, and I walked toward the door without looking back. The consequences, once they began, moved faster than even Sophia had predicted. Ellison Restoration defaulted on its line of credit within 2 months, the 90-day grace period on my withdrawn guarantee expiring just as a slow winter had already dried up new contracts. And without my signature quietly propping up the company's foundation, the bank called the loan in full. Derek was forced to lay off his entire remaining crew, sell 2 company trucks at auction, and eventually, in April, file for the kind of restructuring that leaves a man's name attached, publicly, permanently, to the word failure in a small town where everyone reads the same local business filings. Christine and Paul missed 2 mortgage payments before Paul, in a conversation I heard about secondhand from Lily, finally admitted to his wife what he had apparently suspected for over a year, that they had never actually been able to afford that house on their own income, and that the $1,150 gap I had been quietly covering represented, in his words, the entire margin between comfort and collapse. They sold the house in June at a modest loss and moved into a rental 2 towns over, considerably smaller than the home with the fountain that ran even in winter. Vanessa, I heard, deleted every social media account she owned within a week of the hearing, after a screenshot of that original Thanksgiving post paired with details of the conservatorship petition that had, by then, become a matter of local gossip through channels I never traced and never asked Dot to trace on my behalf, began circulating through the small, tight social circles of our town with a speed that no privacy setting could have contained. The apologies, when they came slowly and unevenly, and I want to be honest that I did not accept most of them the way people expect a grandmother in a story like this one to accept them. Warmly, immediately, gratefully, as though forgiveness were owed simply because it was finally, belatedly offered. Christine called first, in late spring, crying, asking to meet, and when we finally sat across from each other at a small diner 2 towns from either of our homes, she spent the first 20 minutes explaining, defending, minimizing, telling me she had never truly believed I was declining, that Vanessa had been the one pushing hardest, that she had simply gone along with it because it was easier than fighting her sister-in-law and her own guilt about the financial help she had never quite managed to stop needing. I listened to all of it, and when she finished, I told her the only thing I had, by then, decided was true. I do not need you to explain why you did it, Christine. I need you to understand that I heard, on a recording, in your brother's own voice, a plan to have me declared incapable so that my life could be managed by people who had already decided I was more useful to them controlled than free. I do not think you fully understood what you were signing on to, but you signed on to it anyway. And I am not interested in rebuilding a relationship with someone who needs me to forget that in order to feel comfortable again. She left that diner in tears, and I let her go, and it would be another 5 months filled with slow, careful, unglamorous work on her part. Therapy she did not tell me about until much later, a genuine and sustained distance from Vanessa's influence, before I allowed her back into my life at all. And even then, cautiously, in small doses, the way you let a burned hand near heat again only gradually. Derek I did not speak to for over 8 months. When we finally did speak, it was at Lily's insistence, a carefully arranged dinner at my house, just the 2 of us, and he sat across from me at that same kitchen table, considerably thinner, considerably quieter, a man who had lost a business, a marriage, since Vanessa had left him amid the wreckage of everything the conservatorship petition had cost them both, and a version of himself he no longer seemed entirely sure he recognized. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me tonight," he said, staring at his hands rather than at me. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask you that yet. I just wanted you to know that I understand, now, exactly what I was willing to do to you, and I don't think I'm ever going to stop being ashamed of it." I did not forgive him that night either. But I told him something I meant, something that had taken me the better part of a year to fully believe myself. I said, "Derek, I am not interested in punishing you forever. I am interested in seeing, over time, through your actions and not your apologies, whether you are capable of becoming someone I can trust again. That is not a door I am closing. It is simply a door I am no longer willing to leave permanently unlocked." He nodded, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, the particular relief of a man who has been handed not forgiveness, but the possibility of it, which, I have come to believe, is sometimes the more honest and more valuable gift. Lily stayed close through all of it, closer than she had ever been, in fact, as though the crisis had burned away everything false between us and left only what was real. She spent that summer at my house more than at her father's, helping me repaint the kitchen, learning to manage the modest investment account I finally formally established in her name. An account funded not by guilt or obligation, but by genuine, uncomplicated love, the kind that no longer needed to disguise itself as rescue. I stood at the stove one evening in late August, teaching her to make the same bread we had made together when she was 10 years old, flour dusting both our cheeks now instead of just hers. And she looked over at me and said, quietly, "Grandma, I'm really glad you didn't let them win. They never should have thought there was a version of winning available to them in the first place," I told her, smiling. That was always the mistake. Not that they underestimated an old woman, that they underestimated exactly who this old woman had spent her whole life quietly becoming. I want to tell you, before I let you go tonight, about the small dinner I hosted this past Thanksgiving, 1 year after that first terrible one. It was a small table, smaller than the one in that photograph from the year before, considerably smaller than the one my own mother used to set when I was a girl. Dot was there, laughing too loudly at her own jokes the way she always does. Sophia came, at my insistence, because I had decided somewhere along the way that the woman who helped save my life deserved a seat at my table for the rest of it. Lily sat beside me, 20 pounds of turkey between us that we had cooked together that morning, flour and butter, and the particular warm chaos of a kitchen that finally, again, had people in it who wanted to be there. Christine came too, carefully, cautiously, bringing a pie she had made herself. Her first real attempt at reconciliation translated into something as simple and as old-fashioned as baking. Derek did not come. Not yet, though he called that evening and we spoke for nearly 20 minutes, longer than we had managed across that careful autumn dinner at my kitchen table. And it felt, for the first time, like the beginning of something rather than the echo of something lost. I looked around that table that evening, at the faces that had chosen deliberately to be there, and I thought about the phrase that had once been thrown at me like a door closing in my face. Finally, a quiet table. They had been wrong about so much, that family, in the years leading up to that Thanksgiving, but they were most wrong, I think, about what a quiet table actually means. A quiet table is not one where an inconvenient old woman has finally been removed. A quiet table is one where everyone sitting at it has finally stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped treating love like a transaction to be managed rather than a gift to be honored. Not one person at my table that night needed a single thing from me. That was the whole difference, and it took me 69 years and one courtroom to hear it properly. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Dot said it to me in a doctor's waiting room in December, and I have thought about it nearly every day since, and I have never once found a place where it was not true. My table, that second Thanksgiving, was quiet in exactly that way, and it was, without question, the fullest room I have sat in since Walter died. If there is one thing I hope you carry away from this evening with me, it is this. The people who count on your silence to get away with something are almost always the people who have underestimated exactly how much quiet strength you have been carrying, unnoticed, your entire life. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It is, if you let it be, the single greatest advantage you will ever be handed. Because no one prepares a defense against a threat they have already decided does not exist. I spent 69 years being the woman who apologized for taking up space at other people's tables. I am not that woman anymore. And whatever table you are sitting at tonight, wherever this finds you, whatever quiet cruelty you may have survived from people who were supposed to love you best, I want you to know that it is never too late to stop shrinking yourself to fit into a life that was never built to hold the full size of who you actually are. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who owed you the most? Have you ever discovered, the way I did, that the quietest people in a room are so often carrying the most weight? Tell me your story in the comments below, because I read every single one. And I promise you, wherever you are tonight, someone else reading beside you needs to hear that they are not alone in this either. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you even a little of your own strength, or your own table, or your own long overdue reckoning, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, so that stories like mine can keep finding the people who need them most. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I will see you at the next table.